everyone. On behalf of the Academic Writing Education Center, I welcome you to Reading to Connect. Today is our Week 6 unit. Are you excited? Today we'll be looking at the topic of critical reading. Now, a lot of people have this misconception thinking, critical reading, does that mean that I'm looking at an article and I'm tearing it apart? I'm finding the faults, the weaknesses, and the fallacies in it, and criticize every single aspect of it. That is a false assumption. Critical reading is essentially developing your logical arguing skills, essentially how to give a constructive criticism based on the evidence, the arguments, the ideas that's given, and be able to give that feedback constructively and not just critically criticizing the faults of an article. And so let's look at what we are going to learn today. A lot of time when we are reading an article, have you ever considered who's behind these words? Who is talking? Why are they saying these things? And the style they're saying it, does that contain a particular meaning they're trying to convey? Essentially, our first learning goal today is to analyze the purpose and the tone of an author's writing through a variety of texts and see how they affect the text themselves. Second, we're going to try to determine whether or not the texts we're seeing are facts or opinions. Let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do today is that we're going to look at the headline of several news articles and determine what do they tell us. Let's go. Number 1, Scenes from the Heart, backstory of a 16-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg. Number 2, teen climate icon used for fundraising without her knowledge. Number 3, Greta Thunberg's defiance upsets the patriarchy and is wonderful. Number 4, Greta Thunberg tells world leader to end fossil fuel madness. And the last, number 5, Greta Thunberg, a controversial fame and downfall. So based on this headline, what do you think they're trying to tell you? And how do you know that? Are there subtle clues within the text, particular words they're using, particular way they're phrasing it, that allows you to determine what they're trying to tell you? So let's look at these 5 different news headings again. The first one, they're probably looking to entertain. We can see it from the first bit, Scenes from the Heart, or we can determine the purpose of this headline from the use of the word backstory. We're probably going to be looking at a piece of news article that illustrates a story and how it came to be. So the purpose of this particular article is probably to act as a story or a narrative to entertain the reader. Now, the second and the fourth news headline is probably to inform us of something. Neither of these news articles uses words that triggers emotion. Neither of these news articles uses words that are not neutral. They are all based on fact and not opinions. So we're probably going to be looking at news articles that are describing a process or event that did take place without the input of the author themselves. Now, in comparison to the previous news headline, where news headline number 3 and 5, we're probably looking at some kind of persuading article. Let's look at number 3 first. Number 3 uses the word defiance and the word upset. So we know that in this particular article, it's going to describe a behavior that was conducted by Greta Thunberg and how it actually triggers negative emotions in other people. And so with that, they must have to be able to provide plenty of evidence to support this particular argument. And hence the aim of this news article is probably going to try to convince us how it actually did upset the readers or the persons involved in this event. Whereas for news heading number 5, it talked about a controversial fame or downfall. The word controversial do bring about and demonstrate the attitude of the author, saying that he wants to show us as the reader how Greta Thunberg's actions are controversial. With that again, they will need to provide plenty of evidence to support this particular argument. And hence from these 2 news article headlines, we'll be able to know their aim is to persuade. Now that we're done with a little bit of warming up activity, we're going to start with today's main topic. The first thing we're going to try to do today is to determine the purpose of the author or the purpose of the reading. So in general, purpose are expressed through three forms. Number one is to inform, letting you facts or enlighten the reader on a topic they're not familiar with. Number two is to persuade, either through a series of arguments or providing evidence to promote or to argue or to convince you on agreeing with their point of view. Number three is to entertain. Essentially, the author is creating or describing an event, a story, or something that took place and to allow the reader to enjoy the process. Now, with these three different forms or purposes, we're going to start with the first one, which is to inform. So spend a couple minutes, read through this particular text, and then we're going to come back and discuss it and how it is informing us of a particular information. Let's go. Biology in action, preventing habitat destruction with wise wood choices. Most consumers do not imagine that home improvement products they buy may be contributing to a habitat loss and species extinctions. Yet, the market for illegally harvested tropical timber is huge, and the wood products often find themselves in building supply stores in the United States. One estimate is that up to 10% of the imported timber in the United States, which is the world's largest consumer of wood products, is illegally logged. In 2006, this amounted to $3.6 billion in wood products. Most of the illegal products are imported from countries that act as intermediaries and are not the originator of the wood. How is it possible to determine if a wood product, such as flooring, was harvested sustainably or even legally? The Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, certifies sustainably harvested forest products. Looking for their certification on flooring and other hardwood products is one way to ensure that the wood has not been taken illegally from a tropical forest. There are certifications other than the FSC, but these are run by timber companies, thus creating a conflict of interest. Another approach is to buy domestic wood species. While it'd be great if there was a list of legal versus illegal woods, it is not that simple. Logging and forest management laws varies from country to country. What is illegal in one country may be legal in another. Where and how a product is harvested and whether the forest from which it comes is being sustainably maintained all factors into whether a wood product will be certified by the FSC. It is always a good idea to ask questions about where a wood product came from and how the supplier knows that it was harvested legally. How did you enjoy the reading? Now let's look at how this particular article is trying to inform us of particular information. If you were to look at the screen in the highlighted bit, we can see two sentences. Number one is an estimate that is up to 10% of the imported timber, etc., whereas the second one provided a year when in 2006 something happened. Both of these are facts. Both of these are numerical statistic figures that the authors provided to present their facts. And then, in a lot of these articles where their purpose is to inform, they will also cite references. These references are usually credible organizations or institutions to show or to demonstrate that their information comes from a credible source and is believable, and thus be able to give out information that are accurate. And so in this text, the author intends to inform the reader about how to choose wood product wisely to prevent forest habitat destruction. Now, this is definitely an informational text because the author's opinion is not explicitly stated. Instead, the author explains the issue and then provides facts with statistic and an expert opinion, like what we just saw, the FSC. With that, this is how the article is able to support the author's point of view. And so to determine if the purpose of an article is informational, you need to look for an abundance of facts and figures, as well as expert quotes or sources relevant to the information or the topic that's been discussed. Now that we're done determining how to recognize an article when their purpose is to inform, let's look at the second type, which is to persuade. We're going to be looking at a speech from Obama addressing America's school children. Now I want you to read through this speech very carefully to see which bits that help you recognize that these are persuasive cues to make you think to yourself, wow, that is really powerful and I really want to believe this man. Let's go. President Obama's national address to America's school children. But at the end of the day, we can have the most dedicated teachers, the most supportive parents, the best school in the world, and none of it will make a difference. None of it will matter unless all of you fulfill your responsibilities, unless you show up to those schools, unless you pay attention to those teachers, unless you listen to your parents and grandparents and other adults and put in the hard work it takes to succeed. That's what I want to focus on today. The responsibility each of you has for your education. I want to start with the responsibility you have to yourself. Every single one of you has something that you're good at. Every single one of you has something to offer. And you have a responsibility to yourself to discover what that is. That's the opportunity an education can provide. Maybe you could be a great writer. Maybe even good enough to write a book or article in a newspaper. But you might not know it until you write that English paper, that English class paper that's assigned to you. Maybe you could be an innovator or an inventor. Maybe even good enough to come up with the next iPhone with a new medicine or vaccine. But you might not know it until you do your project for your science class. Maybe you could be a mayor or a senator or a Supreme Court justice, but you might not know that until you join student government or the debate team. And no matter what you want to do with your life, I guarantee that you'll need an education to do it. You want to be a doctor or a teacher or a police officer? You want to be a nurse or an architect, a lawyer or a member of our military? You're going to need a good education for every single one of those careers. You cannot drop out of school and just drop into a good job. You've got to train for it and work for it and learn for it. Now, how did you find the reading? In this particular text, US President Obama speaks to American school children about every young kid's responsibility for his or her own actions, as well as their responsibility for his or her own education. He uses the first and second persons to voice his opinion, and his language use urges the reader to take actions to think, to believe, and to feel. Did you believe him after reading the speech? Now, having determined how to recognize articles with the purpose of persuading, we're going to now look at article with the purpose of entertaining. Now, when you're looking at this particular article, I want you to read carefully on whether or not the author only has a single purpose or multiple purpose. And are their purpose explicit, or do you need to implicitly infer it? Good luck and let's go. At 2 in the afternoon, I drove the 5 miles from our apartment complex into downtown Texarkana to drop off voter registration forms and mail paperwork about my recent change in residency to my employer. My husband's job has brought me to this small city straddling the border of Texas and Arkansas, where everything still felt quaint and unfamiliar. Driving home down Jefferson Avenue on the Arkansas side of the town, I passed a grocery store parking lot where a farmer had parked his beat-up truck and shoddy trailer under a faded awning. The trailer was loaded up with the last of his watermelon harvest, late season, probably sweet as they come. The truck bed held early season sweet potatoes, end of the summer fair and beginning of the winter store, all in one load. The farmer's back was facing me as he helped a woman buying watermelons. His arms were huge and his shoulders wider than a yardstick. He was tall, big, sunburned on his neck and upper arms. Without warning, tears filled my eyes. Although this farmer was a stranger to me, I recognized his profile. I knew his stories, including the toil, drudgery, and poverty that too often marked a hard-working farmer's life. That life was just 2 generations back for me. My grandma Wanda grew up a farmer's daughter. Great-grandpa George was a farmer, and cowhand, and blacksmith, and sheep shearer, and whatever else he could do to put food on the table. Now, in this particular article, we may find that the author has more than one main idea. It talked a lot about reminiscing. It talked a lot about memory, about past experiences. So there's a multitude of different purposes and the meaning that the author is trying to convey. And so when you have authors who may have more than one purpose in a text, the author's purpose is usually stated explicitly in the text's main idea or in their thesis statement. But in some cases, the author's intent may have to be inferred implicitly with the example we just seen. The author did not specifically talk about what their main purpose of telling us the story of this man on a truck with his description, everything about that today. But we can infer implicitly about their feelings towards this particular man and how these feelings brings back and how these feelings relates to their past life experience. Now, what we're going to be doing is that we're going to look at a second story. With this particular story, again, I want you to be looking at the different purposes or the different meaning the author is trying to imply. How many meaning can you infer from this particular story? Let's go. The danger of a single story. I'm a storyteller, and I like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about age of 7, stories in pencils with crayon illustration that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kind of stories reading. All my characters were white and blue eyes. They played in the snow, they ate apples, and they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My character also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer, but that's another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books by their very nature had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books. But because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Lay, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, people with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognize. Now, I love those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. And so with this particular story, what we've seen is the dangers of a single story and how the point of view can be influenced based on the reception of information the author has received. We've seen a multitude of different meanings that can be inferred from this particular story. One, it could be that a child's perspective or a child's perception is easily influenced based on the information they are given. 2. How dangerous it is that a single point of view can influence a person without other inputs. Many meaning can be derived from a single story. Each person perceives the same story differently based on their life experiences and based on their opinions and previous knowledge. And so by doing that, we are able to utilize our skills from the previous week that we've learned to integrate it with that and to be able to form our opinions logically and critically. Now, having discussed the 3 types of purposes, we're going to be looking at tone. Now, what exactly is tone? Is it just simply how someone speaks? Essentially, tone demonstrates the author's attitude, either through word choices, how they use their imagery, their perspective, the style of their words, and subject matters. By understanding tone, we'll be able to better understand the author's perspective and attitude. A lot of time, tone is expressed through particular adjective. So in later, we will be discussing what forms of attitudes can be determined through what forms or what type of adjectives. Now, the first thing we're going to be looking at is how tone can be expressed. So a lot of time, tone can be expressed through grammar and sentence structures. We'll be looking at whether the sentences are declarative or interrogative, are they simple or complex, active or passive, or whether the sentences contains modifier or quantifiers. Now, the level of formality within the sentence or the word usage, for example, is it more verbal? Is it more academic? All these are how tone can be conveyed in the text. Now, besides grammar, sentence structure, as well as word usage, tone can also be conveyed through point of view. Point of view, namely first person, second, or third, basically expresses the author's point of view or their position that is related to a subject. Now, an author can be biased or objective. A lot of time we are able to determine whether or not the author's attitude towards a particular subject matter through the use of different pronouns. For example, if the author uses a lot of I, it's more subjective because they're expressing their own individual opinions. But often in time, in academic texts, a lot of these pronouns will be eliminated to remain a neutral stance. And so with point of view, by using a second person point of view, you are able to build a more direct connection between the reader and the writer, such as by using the word you, yourself, or yours. By using a lot of second person you, yourself, or yours, we're able to better connect with our reader. As you read the text, it feels like you're standing right in front of the person and that person talking directly to you. Many of these times, second person will be used in persuasive writings. The idea is that for you to take action, or it feels like someone's holding your hand and telling you that it is okay, you can do anything you want, and you can do it. Now, when we are talking about point of view, third person point of view is often used more in informative writing. The reason for that is because by using third person perspective, it actually detaches the author themselves from the writing. Now, by detaching, it doesn't mean that the author is shedding all responsibility or all feelings and attitude they have for this particular writing. But rather, what they're doing is that they're making themselves less biased and more objective. Because third person tend to convey less emotions and less individualistic opinions. Now we're going to look at a speech by President Obama on his address to America's school children. Good luck. Happy reading. Now, when we look at this particular speech, what is one particular thing that you find? Isn't that just something we talked about? The use of second person point of view, you. We can see you appearing throughout the entire speech, trying to persuade you, trying to stand right in front of you, telling you what to do, to take action. And so the use of second person pronoun here is very effective and very persuasive. And so we can now determine that the purpose of this particular speech is definitely the second one, to be persuasive. Now we're going to look at another example of President Ronald Reagan on his address to the Challenger disaster and his words to the family who have lost their loved ones. Let's go. For the family of 7, we cannot bear as you do the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had the special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge and I'll meet with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truth. They wished to serve, and they did. They serve all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the member of the Challenger's crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger's crew was pulling us into the future and will continue to follow them. Now, having read this speech, can you tell me, is it an informational, an emotional, or persuasive speech? So in this particular speech, we can see that they use a lot of third-person pronoun, like we and us. Previously, we talked about how this actually detaches the author from the text and making them less biased. Nonetheless, I want you to focus on the fact that throughout the text, the president actually argues and talked about how the American people stands together with the victim of the Challenger disaster. And so despite the fact that they are using third-person pronoun, they're actually bringing the text together. So which of the three purposes would be for this particular speech? I think it would be emotional, because it actually feeds to the sadness of the person who's reading it, and feeds to the sadness of those people who were listening to it at the time. So let's do a quick review. How can you find tone? How can you determine tone? Number one is through the point of view. When you are reading a second-person narrative, you feel like you're having a conversation with whoever is speaking to you. You're basically talking through them through the text you're reading. And tone is especially effective when you're giving out instructions, when you're propagating ideas, or you're persuading the reader to take actions. Now, what other things can express tone? We can be talking about word choices or imageries. So we can be looking at whether the words are longer or shorter, whether they are commonly seen, whether they are rarely seen. Are they more technical or are they more verbal? Or they're emotionally charged or more scientifically, factually stated. Now, we can also detect tone through the organization of a text, whether it's chronological, comparison or contrast, cause or effect. By saying so, we're going to be looking at several different types of organization for the text to detect tone. Now, why do we need to know how a text is organized? The organization of a text serves as a blueprint, essentially allowing us to follow the logic of the author. And by being able to successfully follow their logic, we'll be able to better follow their flow of argument, and understand the meaning and the purpose they're trying to convey. So why is it important to learn the skill? Number one, when you can clearly see how the individual arguments or information pieces to fit together, you have a better idea of how they work together to support the author's main idea or the thesis statement. Then, following a regular pattern will make it easier for you to follow and read. In turn, it could help you read faster. And by reading faster, you apply the skill of skimming or scanning, like what we talked about in previous weeks. And at last, a clear pattern organization can help you remember better of what you've just read, as well as helping you in your note-taking skills. Now, the first pattern that we're going to talk about is chronological pattern, also called time order, or the sequence of an event. Now, this particular type or organization is probably the easiest to recognize because it's organized chronologically through how time is ordered. Essentially, how a story happened. Now, this particular organization can be done differently. Number one, it could be a list pattern, which means you're listing different items of the same event or same story together. Now, it could also be a process pattern, which is arranging information in a step-by-step manner to help better describe or explain the sequence of the event. There are more cues to help us recognize that this piece of article is indeed organized chronologically. A lot of key words could be the WH word, when and why and what happened. It could be words that describe time, such as before and after. It could be keywords such as steps or processes. All these are keywords to help us recognize that this text is organized chronologically. Now, let's look at this particular example. Can you recognize the keywords that are used in this text that describe chronological process? Let's go. Daily life in ancient China. Chinese culture is one of the oldest in the world today. Over 6,000 years ago, this culture began to develop in the Yellow River Valley, and many of those ancient practices are still observed in the present. The Chinese developed a society based on respect for the spirits of the earth, one's ancestors, the gods, and other people. It was believed that the world was governed by spirits and deities, and so people should behave as though they were in the presence of these spirits at all times. Daily life in ancient China changed through the centuries but reflected these values of the presence of the gods and one's ancestors in almost every time period. In the prehistoric age, 5,000 years BCE, people lived in small villages in the Yellow River Valley. Villages like Banpo show evidence of a matriarchal society where there was a priestly class dominated by women who governed and were the religious authorities. The people lived in small, round homes built into the ground, wore the skin of animals, and practices an animalistic form of religion. Small villages like Banpo grew into larger communities and then into cities. The Xia dynasty, from 2070 to 16,000 BCE, is the first form of government in China which established large cities. It was thought to be mostly mythological until archaeological evidence was discovered which, according to some scholars, proved its existence, although this evidence continued to be debated. After the Xia came the Shang dynasty, when writing was developed and the first written evidence appeared of what life was like for people in ancient China. Now, in this particular reading, we can see several different bits that actually help us to determine the process, that can help us determine that this is indeed organized chronologically. The first one is in its opening. It says that Chinese culture is one of the oldest in the world today, over 6,000 years. And this process began to do something. In the next bit, it talked about the prehistorical age, and again, it gave another numerical data. Furthermore, it also gave us when Xia dynasty and when Shang dynasty began, as well as first, after, when. These are all keywords that was mentioned that help us determine the flow of author's logic. Next, we're going to talk about comparison and contrast organization. This particular organization usually talk about the similarity and the differences between two subject matter. Essentially, we want to see how these two different subject matters or similar subject matter are actually similar or different from one another. And so when we are talking about comparison and contrast organizations, we'll be using a lot of keywords such as in comparison to, likewise, or the same as, or something like, or also. When we want to talk about the similarities, we'll be using keyword or transitional signals like in spite of, despite of, different from, although, or opposed to. These are all different signal words that can help us determine that this is a compare and contrast organization. Now, again, I want you to read this particular comparison and contrast article and help me recognize and identify the different signal words we've just talked about. Let's go. Understanding racial socialization. In a society that is still racially prejudiced, African American parents continue to find it necessary to teach their children about African American culture and to prepare them for the bias and discrimination they can expect to encounter. Scholars in sociology and other disciplines have studied this process of racial socialization. One of their most interesting findings is that African American parents differ in the degree of racial socialization they practice. Some parents emphasize African American identity and racial prejudice to a considerable degree, while other parents mention these topics to their children only minimally. The reason for these differences have remained unclear. In this particular reading, we can see that some of the transitional signal we just talked about do appear. So this reading was talking about the different education method by African American parents. So we can see that number one, there's differ. How different parents in their method of teaching their child about African American values are different from one another. And when we compare among these African American parents, we can see that they use some parents do this, while some other parents do that. So by doing so, we are able to see the difference in their education method, despite both groups being African American parents. Next, we're going to be looking at problem solution organization. Usually with this particular kind of organization, we're presenting a problem and essentially how we're going to solve it. So when do we usually see these particular organization? It is usually used in persuasive writings because a lot of time the author of these kind of writing wants to present you with the urgency with a problem they're wanting to solve. But they also want to argue for you to join their team and solve the problem together to take action. So a lot of time they will be presenting a claim in existing problems and offering a valid solution. So how do we recognize that this is a problem solution essay? We'll see keywords such as problem, challenges, difficulty, and a lot of verb will be to solve or to suggest. Again, let's look at this particular example. And then, can you identify the cues within this text that talks about problem-solving solution? Let's go. So in this particular reading, where can we see the problem? The word problem did appear. It also appeared in the form of minutes. So what is the problem? The problem is that it reduced the amount of food. The problem is that it loses money. It creates droughts or other type of storms. It also will result in a collapse of something. So these are all problems that are presented in this writing. Now, how the problem can be resolved, we can see it through the words such as to address the risk, the word regulation, what kind of measures can be taken, what kind of measures proposed, etc. So these are all different ways that we can determine that this particular text is a problem-solving organization. And then we're going to be looking at cause and effect. Essentially, cause and effect organization describes or discusses an event or an action that is caused by another event or another action. Generally speaking, they can be one single event that has caused several different effects, or it could be one effect that has been caused by several different events. So how can we recognize the cues in terms of describing causes? We can talk about the word cause or the reason, or something such as result from or because of. And when we want to talk about cue words that discuss effect, we can talk about results in, as a result of, or as a consequence of. Now, let's look at this particular reading. Can you find the signal words that describe the cause and effect relationship between different arguments? Let's go. Asthma is a chronic and serious disease in which the airway of the respiratory system becomes obstructed, leading to great difficulty expelling air from the lungs. The airway obstruction is caused by inflammation of the airways, leading to thickening of the airway walls and a tightening of the muscles around them, resulting in a narrowing of the airway. Because airways become obstructed, a person with asthma will sometimes have a great difficulty breathing and will experience repeated episodes of wheezing, chest tightness, shortness of breath, and coughing, the latter occurring mostly during the morning and night. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, around 4,000 people die each year from asthma-related causes, and asthma is a contributing factor to another 7,000 deaths each year. The CDC has revealed that asthma affects 18.7 million U.S. adults and is more common among people with lower education and income levels. Especially concerning is that asthma is on the rise, with rates of asthma increasing 157% between 2000 and 2010. So in this particular reading, we're able to find several different keywords that describe cause and effect. It could be the word leading to, or something that is caused by it, and with that, what has resulted in, or something that has happened because of something, such as the airway blockage. Now we can also see what are the main causes and what are the contributing factors and how it affects the consequent number that are on the rise. All these are key words that demonstrated to us that this is a cause and effect organization. So we just talked about 4 different types of points of organization in terms of determining a text. Number 1 is chronological, time-by-time sequence. Number 2 is comparison and contrast, by discussing 2 similar subject matters, but seeing how they're different or similar in what ways. And then we talked about problem solutions, which describes a potential problem and offering solutions. And last, the cause and effect by discussing the event and the consequential effect that it could cause. All these can be used in determining the tone of the author. Now at last, we're going to talk about how to differentiate facts from opinions. Let's look at these 2 different examples. Number 1, a novel coronavirus is a new virus that has not been previously identified. Number 2, a novel coronavirus is a fatal virus that has caused worldwide panic. Now what I want you to do is identify which one of these is a fact, which one of this is an opinion. Knowing the differences between fact and opinion is essential for good reading comprehension, because otherwise a reader will fail to judge whether the information being presented in the reading has value or credibility. And so the differences between facts and opinions is that facts are verifiable, which means that this particular statement can be agreed upon by a consensus of experts. And so based on this, we can determine that an opinion may be supported by facts and principle, in which case it will become an argument. So, knowing the differences between facts and opinions, which one of these two examples is a fact and which one is an opinion? I'll give you 10 seconds. Excellent. So the first one will be a fact, whereas the second one will be opinion. The reason why the first example is a fact is because it uses neutral language with no personal opinion. It simply stated that this is something that has not been previously identified. Whereas for the second example, it used the word fatal disease, an adjective to describe the disease, and cause a worldwide panic. This is more of an observation that may not be agreed by general consensus. So just a restatement. A fact is basically a statement of information that can be proven with evidences such as empirical research, statistical data, official documents or report, testimonies, or direct observation or based on your expert experiences. So some of the examples that we've seen are fact based on our previous reading could be seen on the screen. The first example is more of an observation of how human behavior conducts, whereas the second one is describe a research finding, both of which have evidence to support it. Both are facts. Now, in comparison to facts, an opinion is a personal belief or judgment. It cannot be verified and has no conclusive findings, which means that it is usually subjective and biased. It may use a lot of persuasive words, as well as modifiers on the claims. So two major types of opinions are either expert opinions or personal opinions. Now, let's look at this particular sample sentence. Greta Thunberg speaks bluntly to business and political reader on the immediate action for the climate crisis, and yet her radical approach has been perceived problematic. So in this particular example, we can see the word speaks bluntly, radical, problematic. All these are words describing a negative emotion, but at the same time, they are more of a writer's personal opinion towards Greta Thunberg's action. They are not neutral and they are more so biased. Now let's look at another example that talks about personal opinions supported by facts. In the sample sentence, it reads, Greta Thunberg's sudden rise to world fame has made her a leader and a target. In May 2019, Thunberg was featured on the cover of Time magazine, which named her a next generation leader and noted that many see her as a role model. We can see that in the signal word, it says that she's a leader, a target. Many see her as a role model. Now, although this particular sample sentence did provide a fact, for example, what she achieved, a lot of these are still personal opinion, such as the word rise to fame. Now it's time to test out whether or not you've learned it. You're now going to be looking at a segment of text. You can see that these texts are labeled with different numbers. What you're going to do is that on a piece of paper, you're going to jot down, are these facts or opinions? Let's go. So the correct answer should be that So the correct answer should be that. So in today's lesson, we've learned how to identify the author's purpose and tone through different strategies. We also learned how to differentiate between fact and opinion, in which all these are different skills that will help us in developing our critical reading skills. Through that, we'll be able to also form our own logic and be able to use these analytical skills to further in both our reading and writing. We've also learned that author will use certain tones, for example, different organization of the text to convey different meanings and ideas, as well as the purpose of the text. I hope today's lesson has been valuable to you. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.